These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? White has just played pawn from h2 moves to h3, threatening to take black's bishop. What is black to do? He could retreat the bishop, but around here we don't play defense before looking at offense. White's position looks impregnable but has a subtle weakness. Follow the lines from white's king and you see that the pawn on f2 is pinned. That means it can't guard anything, in particular it means white's knight on g3 is loose. Instead of retreating his bishop, black thus can play knight takes knight and let his g4 bishop get taken. Why is this better than retreat? Because after knight takes knight black's knight attacks white's rook. If white moves the rook, black moves his bishop and has won a piece cleanly. If white takes black's bishop, black pays knight takes rook and wins the exchange after white recaptures. It's another study in how the pawns in front of a king usefully can be pinned, leaving pieces on the third rank open to capture. White to move. What is the best move? Here white has 3 checks with his queen that result in its uncompensated loss, but he also has bishop moves to h5, check. Which is safe and interesting. It requires black to move his king over to d8. When you see a move that will force the king to change squares, ask whether anything will be pinned to it in its new position. A cursory scans reveals that the pawn on d7 will be pinned. Next step, ask whether the pawn is supposed to protect anything that might now be vulnerable. Answer, black's queen on c6 is loose. There is a complication, though, because the only piece white can use to take black's queen is his own queen, which also would be the piece imposing the pin. Once white plays queen takes queen, will the pin of the d7 pawn still be effective? Yes, because the rook behind the queen takes over the pin once the queen moves. The idea here, though only one move away, is not easy to see at the start. It promptly becomes visible when you play with checks and their consequences. White to move. What is the best move? Again, there are a few ways to find the idea here. First, trace out the lines from black's king. On the f-file you see a black pawn, black queen, white bishop, and white rook. The white rook is most significant because it drives up the file and has the power to exert a pin. Of course it doesn't do that now, the possibility is there, though, because of the structure of the file. What would it take to realize that potential? Well, two of the pieces in the way can be eliminated together. If white plays bishop takes knight, black has to reply queen takes bishop to avoid losing his queen to white's rook via discovered attack. Presto, now white has a pin on the f7 pawn. Immediately you consider what the pin was protecting. Answer, the bishop on e6. Can white now play bishop takes bishop? No, not quite yet. Black's queen, now on e5, would be protecting it. But this can be cured by exchanging away the guard with queen takes queen, pawn from d6 takes queen. Now black's bishop is free for the taking. The point is one we have seen before, don't overlook possible pins because there are pieces cluttering the needed line. Think about ways to clear them and ask what would then be possible. This includes cases where the dividend of your maneuvers is a mere pinned pawn. Another way to see the idea would be to observe the pressure on the e5 square occupied by black's knight. It's attacked twice, by white's bishop and queen, and guarded twice, by black's queen and d6 pawn. When you see an evenly guarded square like this, you may not be able to win the piece that sits on it, but you still have the power to control the look of the board by initiating the series of exchanges those attackers and defenders are poised to make. Imagine liquidating the position and ask the usual questions about the resulting position. Here that means white pictures 1. Bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, 2. Queen takes queen, pawn from d6 takes queen. Those exchanges are a wash, but when you imagine the board as it then would look and trace out the enemy king's lines, you see that a pin of the f7 pawn would have come into existence and that it would leave black's bishop on e6 loose. It's worth reinforcing a few times in your mind's eye. Black to move. What is the best move? Pinning a pawn in front of the king as an aid to mate. Pinned pawns, of course, frequently are close to the king, providing cover for it and defending squares nearby. Paralyzing those pawns can do more than leave pieces loose, as in the previous studies, it can make squares available that permit a mating attack. It thus pays to experiment with ways of putting your pieces and prize to any pawns pinned in the king's vicinity. This practice helps offset the psychological tendency to think of squares as off-limits because they appear to be protected, when in fact their defenders are pinned and inert. Pins of pawns in front of the king along diagonals, sometimes from a long distance, are especially common and worth careful study. Those pawns often are supposed to be stopping pieces from landing too close to the king but really aren't. In the position on the left, a scan of the white king's lines reveals a pin of the sort just described against the pawn on b2. So look for pieces and squares the pawn is supposed to protect, and see that the knight on a3 effectively is loose. More than that, play the capture, and check, rook takes knight in your mind's eye and see that white's king has nowhere to go, its position is terrible, as it is backed into the corner of the board with no flight squares. Rook takes knight, checkmate. Thus ends the game. White to move. What is the best move? Again, the key to the position is to study the posture of Black's king, no freedom of movement, and the lines leading from it in search of pins. Here White's bishop pins the pawn on g7. Ask what the pawn supposedly protects, not only what pieces, but what squares. The pinned pawn here is supposed to protect f6. The square therefore is loose, at least for the moment. White tries planting a piece on it, like the queen, and determines that queen moves to f6, checkmate. Is mate. Here as elsewhere we are spelling out the thought process, but of course in practice the insight should be nearly instantaneous. The g7 pawn is pinned, the queen mates on f6. White to move. What is the best move? White's inspection of the Black king's lines turns up a pin of the pawn on g6. How to exploit this? By making aggressive use of one of the two squares the g6 pawn is supposed to protect, h5. Make a threat from there, deliver a check from there. White does it with queen moves to h5, check. Black is forced to move his king to the g-file. Whether he moves it to g7 or g8, White now plays queen takes at g6, check. With the queen enjoying protection from the bishop that formerly imposed the pin, a common pattern we will see repeated. The king retreats to h8, and now White mates with queen moves to h7, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? This time you find no pins, but if you size up the forces bearing on Black's king you see that the bishop on a1 is poised to pin the pawn on g7 if the king can be pushed into the opposite corner. Or you consider every check for White and find two queen moves to h6, which is no good, and rook moves to h8, which requires king takes rook in reply and places the king on a square that leaves the g7 pawn pinned. Either way you realize that h6 now is a loose square, its guard paralyzed. Threaten the king by putting a piece there, queen moves to h6, check. The king's only flight square is g8. The queen's next check is queen takes at g7, checkmate. Which mates with support from the bishop on a1. Notice again how the bishop and queen usefully are coordinated. First the bishop imposes a pin that gives the queen a safe square on which to land, then the bishop provides protection as the queen chases down the king. It was noted early that queen moves to h6, check. Fails. Notice precisely why. It fails because black has black king takes queen, not because black can reply black pawn from g7 takes queen 4 that leads to 2. Rook moves to h8, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Start with an assessment of black's offensive resources. He has a queen not far from white's king, a rook on the e-file, ready to jump to the first rank, and a bishop on the long diagonal. The idea should be clear enough. If the bishop were able to pin the pawn on g2, black's queen could take advantage by moving to h3, then g2, with a mating attack. How to arrange the pin? Hound the king with the rook, and be ready to sacrifice it. Black plays 1. Rook moves to e1, check. 2. King moves to h2, rook moves to h1, check. 3. King takes rook and white's king has been drawn into the corner. Now black takes advantage by putting his queen onto the square that the newly pinned pawn used to protect, queen moves to h3, check. And the king's only flight square is g1. Black mates from here with the simple queen takes at g2, with the queen again taking protection from the same bishop whose pin allowed it to penetrate white's position. The first lesson of the position lies in black's use of his rook. He sees his own bishop on the long diagonal, and wants to get white's king onto h1 so the g2 pawn will be pinned and allow queen moves to h3, check. His first available check rook moves to e1 doesn't get this done, because the king goes to h2. Then comes the key move, rook moves to h1, planting the rook on the square where black wants white's king to go, and forcing it to capture there. This idea sometimes is known as a decoy. We will examine it in more detail elsewhere. Notice that white could not play knight moves to f1 in reply to black's initial rook moves to e1, check. Because then black mates with queen takes at g2. Likewise, white could reply to black's rook moves to h1 with knight takes rook instead of king takes rook. But then black still has queen takes at g2, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Sometimes we begin by looking for a visual pattern, sometimes we begin by looking at forcing moves, for it is important to be able to move between those methods of developing a combination. Let's start this one by considering any checks black can give and their consequences. Easy enough, there is only one: rook moves to h6, check. Which forces black to play king moves to g1. And then what checks would black have? Again, just one: rook moves to h1, check. Which forces king takes rook, a classic, and now familiar, decoy of the king into the corner using successive rook checks. The pawn on g2 now is pinned, thus leaving h3 available for occupation. Black can occupy it with his queen, of course. To white's queen moves to h3, black can only reply king moves to g1, now queen takes at g2, checkmate. Mates, with support for the queen furnished as usual by the bishop that imposed the pin. An important point of the position, when you consider what offensive resources you have available to bring down on the king, be careful not to dismiss too quickly any of your pieces that seem far away or have their paths blocked. Often the paths can become unblocked and those pieces can swoop in quite rapidly. Here the queen looks at first like it is in no position to contribute to an attack, and yet it ends up delivering mate. White to move. What is the best move? Size up white's offensive resources as they bear on the black king's position: a battery of rooks on the d-file, a queen on the 6th rank, and a bishop on b2 aimed down the long diagonal. How can this be turned into a mating attack? It would help white to get his queen over nearer to the black king, so that its pressure on that side of the board could be coupled with pressure from the rooks to put the king in a bind. That would be one way to get at the idea here. Another would be to see that if black's king could be pushed or drawn onto h8, white's bishop would pin the pawn on g7, creating a safe square for his queen on h6. Still another route would be just to consider every check and its consequences. To 1. Rook moves to d8, check. Black replies 1. King moves to h7. Now comes the standard rook sacrifice: 2. Rook moves to h8, check. King takes rook, drawing the king into the corner. With the pawn on g7 pinned, white takes advantage in familiar fashion. He plants his queen on a square the pawn is supposed to protect. 3. Queen takes at h6, check. The king is driven back to g8 where it began, but this time white has trapped it on the back rank by putting pressure down the h-file. He plays 4. Rook moves to d8, check. And mates a move later, as the king has nowhere to go. After 4, rook moves to e8, 5. Rook takes rook, checkmate. White to move. What is the best move? Black has just played pawn from h7 moves to h6, threatening white's knight. What would you play in reply? You know better than to retreat and forfeit the initiative until you have considered offensive play. White has two bishops trained on the king's position. Search for a pin. If you can find one, it may present tactical opportunities that aren't obvious on casual inspection. Here we find a pin of the pawn on f7. Next question, what is that pawn supposed to protect that now is unguarded? Don't just look for loose pieces. Consider loose squares as well. Here the pin weakens e6 and especially g6. Since the square closer to the king is g6, and e6 remains protected by a different pawn, experiment in your mind's eye with ways of putting a piece there, preferably your queen, since you are looking first for a mating attack and the queen normally is the best tool for the purpose. What you discover is that the queen here can't get to g6 in one move. But it can move to d3, or b1 or c2, the point is the same. And now if black plays pawn from h6 takes knight, which after all is white's immediate worry, white can play queen moves to g6 with impunity, taking advantage of the square freed by the pin. How useful would it be to have a queen there? Very. Queen takes at g7 would mate a move later with support from white's dark squared bishop, and there is nothing black would be able to do to prevent it in the meantime. Indeed, 1. Queen moves to d3 gives white a forced mate here no matter what black does. All black can try are inadequate interpositions. One actual sequence might go, 1 queen moves to d3, rook moves to e8, 2 queen moves to g6, rook moves to e5, trying to interpose the rook to cut off the queen's support from the dark squared bishop, 3. Queen takes at f7, instead getting support from the light squared bishop, king moves to h8, queen moves to g8, checkmate. Again, mating with support from the light squared bishop instead of the other one. White to move. What is the best move? The black king's position may look reasonably secure. It isn't. White considers any checks he can give in this case, just one. Queen takes at h7. Black has to reply king takes queen. Trace the lines away from the new position you are imagining for the king and see that the pawn on g6 now would be pinned. That means the two squares the g6 pawn used to protect now are free. White can plant a piece on one of them with rook moves to h5, checkmate. Which mates since g7 is off limits to black's king. A simple case of a queen sacrifice drawing the king into line with a pawn, a measure justifiable as a means to mate. White to move. What is the best move? Study what forces white has trained on the black king's position, his knight on g5, his queen on c2, his knight on d5, and his bishop on b3. The sight of that bishop aimed down the diagonal should cause you to think about possible pins. It has the potential to pin the pawn on f7, which would leave the g6 pawn loose, which the queen then could take with decisive results. How to create the pin? By vacating the white knight from the diagonal forcefully, leaving black no time to escape. White thus plays n-pawn from d5 takes knight, check. Forking, of course, black's king and queen. If black wants to save his queen he replies bishop takes knight. But then the work is done, the exchange has cleared the way for a pin that permits white to play queen takes at g6, check. With impunity. And since black has had to move his bishop, white's move is a check. The black king goes to h8, after which white mates with queen moves to h7, this time with cover from its knight. In the alternative, black might reply to queen takes at g6, check. By retreating his bishop to g7. White's queen then delivers mate from h7. Black to move. What is the best move? Do you see a mating idea for black? The clue is the open H file occupied by his rook. If the rook could land on H1 with protection, the traditional provider of it would be a bishop. We have seen bishop and rook mates like this before it would be mate. As it happens, black has a bishop aimed that way on the long diagonal, but two things lie in its way, the white pawn on d5 and white bishop on g2. Without those pieces, white would be unable to avoid mate. The bishop protects the pawn, and black attacks the pawn twice, so a method of clearing the line comes into view. Black plays queen takes at d5, threatening queen takes bishop, checkmate. White replies bishop takes queen, black plays bishop takes bishop and now is poised to play rook moves to h1, checkmate. Indeed, nothing white does can prevent it. He only has useless interpositions with his bishop or queen on the h-file or with his queen on the long diagonal. What does all this have to do with pins? It is a pin that stops white from effectively blocking the mate with pawn from f2 moves to f3. White's f-pawn is pinned by the bishop on c5, and seeing this might have encouraged the whole thought process above. One consequence of a pin on a pawn is that it can't step forward to block anything. Diagonals on which it might have interposed are left free, giving you more liberty to play on them and arrange attacks using queens and bishops there. White to move. What is the best move? Pins of pieces to allow mate. Pins of pieces may facilitate mating attacks, of course, just as pins of pawns do. The patterns that can arise from pinned pieces are more various. To see them you need to be alert to different ways of delivering mate. Later chapters cover mating patterns in some detail, but in our work so far we have been focusing on two general sorts of ideas. First are mates where two or more of your pieces are coordinated in attacking a square next to the enemy king, most often a queen plus mate where the queen lands next to the king and has cover from another piece, such as a bishop, though we also have seen rook plus mates with the bishop on occasion. The previous position involved a threat of a queen plus mate on g2, then a rook plus mate on h1. The usual way for your opponent to defend against this possibility is to keep a friendly piece near the king to protect the squares on which your queen might like to land. Sometimes you can pin that guard, however, making a safe landing for your queen or rook possible. Another pattern we have been using, and will see again here, arises when the enemy king is trapped on the back rank and you are able to plant a rook or queen there. A common defense against this threat involves pieces that can be interposed on the back rank if hostile pieces are put there, and again those interposing pieces sometimes can be pinned, making the mate possible after all. The position on the left can be understood as a back rank mate or a queen plus mate. The key point to see is that white has a battery of queen and rook on the d-file, trained on a square adjacent to black's king. The critical square d8 appears to be attacked twice by white and defended twice by black, by his bishop and the queen behind it, setting aside the king's protection of the square. But on inspection of the king's lines the e7 bishop is seen to be pinned by white's other rook. White thus is free to play queen moves to d8, checkmate. Ending the game. White to move. What is the best move? White has a potent battery, this time on the f-file. Ideally he would like to drop his queen to f8, let it get captured by black's rook, then recapture with his own rook and deliver mate. The only worry is an interposition. If black then plays bishop moves to e8, the mate seems to be spoiled, for then if white plays rook takes bishop, black has king takes rook. This is a common difficulty in carrying off a back rank mate. But scan the king's lines, or the bishop's vulnerabilities, and you see that the bishop is pinned and can't interpose after all. So 1. Queen moves to f8, check. Followed by 2. Rook takes rook is indeed mate. White to move. What is the best move? Assess the threats to your own king and you see that black is threatening mate with queen takes at h2, as well as the somewhat less formidable, but still troublesome, queen takes rook, check. It's hard to see a satisfactory way to avoid both threats by moving the white pieces around defensively. but we know the value of not reflexively playing defense. In this case, by taking the time to examine the checks he can give, white finds he can disregard the threat and achieve mate himself. The first thing to see is that white almost has a back rank mate with rook moves to e8, but black's rook on f8 blocks the way, and then there is the coordination of white's queen and bishop against f7. If black's rook could be drawn up to f7, it would become pinned and enable the back rank mate to work. You equally might see the idea by just looking at any checks you can give and their consequences. Either way the result is the same: queen takes at f7, check. Requires rook takes queen in response, drawing black's rook into a pin. You take advantage of this by noting the defensive purpose the rook had served and exploiting the new vulnerability with rook moves to e8, checkmate. Black to move. What is the best move? Now the same concept pushed out yet another step and seen from black's side. Black is threatened with rook takes queen. The usual point repeats: don't retreat without considering how you might attack. The vague potential for a back rank mate exists because white's king is stuck under its pawns without much protection except for its queen. The fantasy for black is queen takes at f2 followed by mate on f1 or e1. White's queen stands in the way of this, so black experiments with harassing moves like rook moves to e8 with either rook. Now if white plays rook takes queen, he gets mated with rook takes queen, checkmate. What else can white do? A. He doesn't want to play queen takes rook, he'll then lose his queen on the recapture by black's other rook, which renews the mate threat. B. If white moves his queen to d1, black has checks, queen takes at f2, to which white must reply king moves to h1, then rook moves to e1, check. To which white must reply queen takes rook, then queen takes queen, checkmate. C. White can play queen moves to f1, moving the queen out of the rook's way but keeping it near enough to the king to provide protection. But now comes the pinning pattern we saw in the previous position. Black plays queen takes at f2, check. Taking the pawn in front of the king's only guard and forcing the queen to recapture and become pinned. After white plays queen takes queen, black has rook moves to e1, checkmate. White's best reply to rook moves to e8 was none of those moves, it was queen moves to e3. This still results in losses, but it avoids the larger catastrophes that follow from the other moves. Play might go 1. Rook moves to e8, 2. Queen moves to e3, queen takes rook, 3. Knight takes queen, bishop takes queen, 4. Pawn from f2 takes bishop, and black has won the exchange. Or black might reply to queen moves to e3 by moving his own queen over to b4. Still another possibility is for white to reply to rook moves to e8 with knight moves to e2. This blocks the e-file but leaves the rook on d5 loose and lets it be taken next move. It also leaves white with a bad position. White to move. What is the best move? Both of white's bishops are trained on the black king's position, so is white's rook on g3. His queen isn't quite there yet, but it easily enough could be moved into position to attack with support from one of those other pieces. A natural idea would be to move the queen so it can attack h7, if it landed there with support from the bishop on d3, it would mate. The problem is black's knight on f6, which guards both the square where the white queen wants to go first, h5, and the square where the queen wants to end up, h7, which illustrates why f6 is a great defensive position for a black knight. But white has a way to deal with this. It is suggested by the position of his other bishop on e5. If a netlesome piece has a bishop aimed at it and the king is on the same diagonal, the position cries out for a pin. Be methodical in asking what prevents the pin from existing now. The answer, of course, is the pawn on g7. In effect, there are too many pieces on the pinning line. Earlier we studied ways of overcoming this type of obstacle: take the pawn, causing a recapture that consolidates the enemy's position. Thus white plays rook takes at g7. If black replies with king takes rook, now the knight on f6 is pinned. All the squares it protected g4, h5, and h7 are now vulnerable, so white starts by putting his queen on the first of them. Queen moves to g4, check. Since it's a check, the response king moves to h8 is forced. If black moves his king to h6 instead, white mates with queen moves to g5. Now white moves the queen to h5, again loose because the knight is pinned. Mate follows no matter what black does. He has a number of checks he can give to stall for time, but none of them pan out. Eventually white will either play queen takes at h7, checkmate. Or, if black moves his king to g8, bishop takes knight, then queen takes at h7, checkmate. Or some other accumulation of force against the king's corner. The important lesson is to observe the defensive function a knight positioned like black's can serve, and to see how pinning it can radically reduce the security of his king by opening up key squares for hostile occupation. It is impossible with a handful of examples to suggest all the different ways that a pin can be used to enable a mating attack, but from these studies you can take away a few frequently useful ideas. Once a piece or pawn is pinned, any squares it formerly guarded become more vulnerable and often loose. It helps to imagine placing attackers on those squares to see what then becomes possible. Pinned pawns and pieces also become incapable of interposing themselves between an attacker and your queen. This can be important when trying an attack on the back rank, where interpositions are a common form of defense. It also may be useful in attacking along diagonals or other lines, since interpositions there, especially by pawns stepping forward in front of the king, often are one way for the enemy to cut off an attack by a bishop or other piece. White to move. What is the best move? Pins to mating squares. Since we are considering mating threats, this is a good moment to consider one additional type of pin, a pin of a piece not to its king but to a mating square. A mating attack frequently depends on whether you can get an attacking piece onto some square in particular, e.g., whether you can land your queen next to the enemy king. If one of your opponent's pieces blocks a move like that, it's pinned. The game is lost if it moves. The pin may not be as strong as the usual pin to the king, since a piece pinned to a mating square at least can move legally, if it has a strong threat, a check of its own to deliver, for example, it may be able to get away with leaving its square. It still is important to see pins of this kind, because the pieces subject to them often are prey to capture and useless as defenders of other pieces. Notice in this first diagram that black's king is trapped on the back rank and has no defenders there. This suggests a mating possibility if white can get his rook on e1 down to e8. Alas, he can't do it because black's bishop is in the way. But therein lies a tactical idea. Black's bishop is pinned to a mating square, e8, if attacked it cannot afford to leave the e-file. So white throws a pawn at the bishop with pawn from f2 moves to f3 and takes it a move later. The key to the position lies in examining black's king and seeing its vulnerability. From there you reason backwards to ways you might take advantage and then to obstacles that prevent you from doing so. Finally you consider whether the obstacles are themselves vulnerable by virtue of their defensive role. White to move. What is the best move? You want to cultivate a constant awareness of the enemy king's status, not to mention the status of your own constraints on its movement, pieces aligned with it that might be pinned, and any pieces of yours that are trained on its position. There can be great power in having two pieces, preferably a queen plus another, aimed at a square next to the king even if they can't both get there. In the frame to the left, for example, white's queen and a 5 bishop both are aimed at d8. This is a mating threat. It doesn't work now because black has a pawn in the way on d6. But see the implication of this, the d6 pawn is pinned, since mate results if it moves off of its file. The pawn therefore is not doing any defensive work and anything it seems to protect is vulnerable here, the knight on c5 and the pawn on e5. White is in position to take the e-pawn with knight takes at e5. Following through, he asks about the consequences of putting the knight there. It will attack black's queen. Where will the queen go? Remarkably enough, it has no escape, every square to which it can move is under attack. White will take it on his next move. The trick to the position comes at the outset. You can't let the pawn on d6 prevent you from seeing the pressure white's queen puts on d8. The pawn is not, or not just, an obstacle that ruins the mating idea for white. It is an opportunity, because in order to stop the mate threat the pawn must stay where it is, leaving its protectorates exposed to capture. White to move. What is the best move? Here is a somewhat less usual configuration that depends on a similar principle. Where does white have two pieces aimed at a square next to the enemy king? On the long diagonal, where he has a queen and bishop, the rook on g2 bears down as well, but for now focus on the other two pieces. The battery seems imperfect because the bishop is in front, but still, notice that none of the pieces around black's king can defend the long diagonal. The only piece that can reach it in principle is the knight on f7, but of course you see that it is pinned by white's other bishop on e6. The obvious obstacle to penetrating the black king's position is the black pawn on e5, so play through the sequence that would be possible if the pawn were gone. One bishop moves to h8, and on reflection there would be nothing black could do to stop. Queen moves to g7, checkmate. This is the significance of black's inability to defend the diagonal. What does this mean? It means the pawn on e5 is pinned, since if it moves off the long diagonal white finishes black's king. Rather than obsess over the difficulty of removing the pawn, exploit its immobility by taking something it protects with rook takes knight. Black to move. What is the best move? A look at the white king's position and the constraints on its movement shows that it is stuck on the back rank with no defenders there. A rook is a usual defender against a back rank mate, but white's rook on a1 is blocked by his bishop. This means that if black could drop a queen or rook onto the middle of the back rank, he might mate. The most plausible piece for the purpose would be his queen on d3, so ask what prevents queen moves to d1, checkmate. There are two things, the pawn in the way on d2, and the knight on e3 that protects d1. A pawn in the way is a pawn that is pinned, and this also is the key to dealing with the knight. It is protected by that same pawn, so black is free to take it with rook takes knight. If white recaptures pawn from d2 takes rook, black plays queen moves to d1, checkmate. What about the other pawn that protects the knight, the one on f2? It is pinned as well by the rook on f8. One way to come at this position in the first place is with a study of the white king's lines. You see that the pawn in front of it is pinned, and so inspect any pieces the f2 pawn is supposed to protect. You find the knight on e3, you consider taking it with rook takes knight, and ask about the consequences. You see that pawn from d2 takes rook could result. You observe that this would clear the way for queen moves to d1, checkmate. So both pawns that guard white's knight are pinned, which makes it free for the taking. The general point is cognitive. It's natural to see the d2 pawn and e3 knight here and conclude that they are insuperable obstacles to mate. And they are. But train your mind to regard the obstacles not as frustrations but as opportunities. If they really have such powerful defensive roles, this also implies that they may not be able to move and so may signify other vulnerabilities. White to move. What is the best move? White's knight attacks h7, and white's queen is aimed at that square as well. If black's queen were gone, white could play queen takes at h7, checkmate. In this sense, black's queen is pinned to a mating square. What do we do with a pinned queen? We studied this a little while ago. One thing to try is a cross pin, attacking a queen pinned along a diagonal by adding a rook that attacks it along the file where it sits. Here that would mean white playing rook moves to f4, threatening rook takes queen. The question about such a move is what white's rook then would be able to do if black's queen moved to play queen takes queen. The answer is obvious: white plays rook takes rook, checkmate. A simple back rank mate. So after rook moves to f4, the queen becomes pinned to mating squares in two directions. Since black can't afford this result, he must submit to rook takes queen.